All right, it's 10:01, so we're going to get going, and we're going to kick it off today. And I appreciate you all being here today. This is a really probably the most timely topic that we've ever done for one of our coach educational webinars. So thank you for being a part of it. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. I like seeing some of the houses that you're living in and working in. I know a lot of you have either kids or pets, and so it's a challenge, and I certainly know that. So again, I hope everything is great and we're navigating a really challenging time that takes a toll on not only our body and our mind, our families, and our work. So again, I think we'll get a lot out of today. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily to introduce the topic and our presenter, and we'll go from there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. And as Dan said, thank you all so much for being here. Echoing everything Dan said, I hope everybody's doing well, staying mentally and physically healthy during this time. This webinar is on coach mental health. Obviously, this time is so unprecedented. We're all dealing with stressors of working from home, being away from student athletes. It's wild and crazy time, and we haven't seen anything like it before. So today we are so fortunate to have Dr. Jaimie Rubin of Premier Sports Psychology here with us. Jaimie, thank you so much for doing this webinar today. We are so excited to have you. I'll just give a little bit of background and then I'll hand it off to Jaimie to get started. Jaimie earned her master's in athletic counseling and her doctorate degree in counseling psychology with a specialization in sports psychology from Springfield College. She's worked with a wide variety of clientele at all divisions and has worked as a counseling and mental training specialist for both the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and the Collegiate Baseball League out of Europe. But the most but an important thing that we want to note today is that Jaimie does have a background athlete and as a Division III coach for 5 years at Springfield. So she can really relate to everybody who's on this call today. And like I said, we're very fortunate to have her here. So we've got about 45 minutes lined up with Dr. Rubin. And if you all have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And we will read them out to Dr. Rubin so she can answer any questions you might have throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we're going to hope to leave some time at the end to answer some questions as well. So with that being said, I will hand it off to Dr. Rubin.
Hi, everybody. I'm super grateful to be here. I'm excited to be able to present this topic to all of you today. It's so important, as was pointed out already. And so I'm just thrilled and grateful that I get to do it for all of you. I'm just going to go ahead and screen share. I encourage you all to have sort of a split screen going on so that you can see both myself and the screen share at the same time. I think you can do that based on your speaker view. So I'm just going to go ahead and screen share first so we can get started. Okay. Move this out of the way here. Emily, maybe you can tell me if it's all good.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Okay. So, so as was introduced, this is what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm looking forward to it. So let's get started. First thing I want to do, this is for myself and for all of you. This picture on the left here, this just straight up describes what it's been like for myself, and I'm going to go ahead and assume it's been like that for some of you as well. I've heard it from coaches, athletes, athletic personnel, basically everybody I've been talking to, friends and family. And so I want to just take a minute to get us all here, to get everybody to the place where we're currently at and to be present. And so I'm going to invite you all to turn your screens off. You can mute your video if you like. Sometimes it's more comfortable for people to do that. I know you're already muted your sound, so go ahead and mute your video if you're more comfortable. And I'll also invite you all to just sort of sit back and close your eyes if you're comfortable. If you're not comfortable closing your eyes, that's okay too. Maybe you can just soften your gaze, lighten your gaze a little bit. So as you go ahead and do that, I just want you to take a moment to sit in the chair that you're in, on the bed that you're on the floor that you're on, whatever it may be. Just find yourself sitting there and just start to notice your body. Notice your feet and your toes. Notice how your legs feel as you're sitting in that chair. Notice your back against the wall or against the back of the chair. Maybe your back's not against anything. Notice how your shoulders feel. How maybe when I note them, they tend to relax. Or maybe they're feeling really tense. Notice how your hands rest in your lap or on the table in front of you. And as you're noticing your body, if you find yourself becoming distracted by another noise in the room or honking outside, kids in the background, that's okay. Take note of that thought. Take note of the distraction. Accept that distraction. That's normal. So take note of it and then just bring yourself back to your breath. And now that we've sort of brought our body into the room, I want us to bring our attention to our breath. You don't have to breathe deeply or hold your breath. I just want you to notice how you're breathing right now in this space. How your body and your breath are working together to bring you here to this moment. So just notice the oxygen coming in through your nose. Notice how it feels in your body, and then back out again. Again, if you find yourself becoming distracted by any of your senses, a smell, a noise, a feeling in your body, that's okay. Just notice it and bring yourself back to your breath. Now you may have a lot of thoughts rolling through your mind. I wonder when she's going to start. I wonder when this is going to end. I wonder if I'm going to get all my things done today. Whether my kid's going to run through the room. I wonder what's going on with my health or the health of my family. That's okay. Those are normal thoughts. As you notice them, accept them, and come back to your breath in the present moment. And as you continue to breathe, I'm just going to note for you a quote or two that I've heard over the last few days that I think are really important to getting us started today. And maybe we can be mindful of those as we go through this presentation. The first is that you're not working from home. You're at your home during a crisis, attempting to work. And I think that's so important to keep in mind. So let that sit with you for a moment in this present moment. Continue to breathe. And the second quote that I want to offer you all. If you are currently, or if you have been experiencing distraction, anxiety, or fear, even if that's been happening during this 2 minutes, that's okay. That means your brain is working. So let's keep that in mind too, that when we have those distractions during mindfulness or any other time when we're working or experiencing anxiety or fear, that is our brain's normal reaction. It's supposed to happen. So let's try to be mindful of that as well when we're experiencing those things. Continue to bring yourself back to your breath. When you're ready, you can bring yourself back into the room. Turn back on your camera and be present with this presentation. Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all for doing that with me. I appreciate taking that time for yourself so that you could be here even more. I know it's so distracting out there even while you're trying to do that, but it's so distracting. We all come in, we're rushing all day long, even though it's the morning. You've probably been up forever, you're all coaches, so I know you're getting after it. Whether that's with your kids, your family, or that's with your players far away, recruiting, whatever it may be. You're getting after it early, we're rushing, then we all come in and sit down for a presentation and hope that we can pay attention. Sometimes we just need that extra few minutes to really sit here. So I appreciate you all doing that with me. Okay. I already had an introduction, so no need to do that again. I appreciate that introduction, Emily. So let's go to the next thing. Okay, so I just want to give you a really brief overview about what we'll be talking about today. First, we're going to get into the mental phases of COVID-19 that we're seeing. Then we're going to talk about some compassion fatigue and burnout, particular mental health concerns that we're seeing right now, especially with people like yourself, coaches, administrators. And then we're going to get into being ISO'd in isolation and what are the best ways we can manage as coaches in particular. As coaches, as athletic admin, as athletic trainers, what are the best ways that we can manage for ourselves with regards to our own mental health and regards to our own experiences. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Though, as Emily said, if you have questions throughout, she'll be on the chat function and hopefully there'll be a pause or two or I'll get a hand up from her and we'll ask a question if that's needed. Okay, so for the mental phases of COVID-19, this model was developed from a lot of the experiences that we were hearing from coaches and athletes and administrators from right now. It also has to do with how we understand people when they go through major changes, but the particulars about this model is particular to this experience that we're all going through right now. So it's important to keep that in mind because we want you to know that if you're experiencing anything within this model, you're not alone. That's normal. And just because you're a coach, you're not immune to these phases. Or just because you're in an administrative role, or just because you have to take care of people because you're a parent or you're the coach of all these athletes, and that doesn't make you immune to the circumstances of what's going on. So you're not alone in that. I think the important things to keep in mind when we see this model is to increase your awareness of what phase you may be experiencing and when. And each time you come back to it, you should do that for yourself. Then you want to learn and practice acceptance of where you're at, the emotions and the thoughts that go along with that phase. Remind yourself that that's normal. And another great way of reminding yourself that that's normal is to share those thoughts and emotions with others or to hear from others about that experience. And then the last piece of the phase is to engage in actions that are going to be most helpful for you in those moments. And that's an important one to remember as well. That's the one that we'll talk about primarily today. So here's a great depiction of this model, and you'll actually get a packet after this workshop by email from Emily. And that's going to have this as well as some other resources and tips and more information about some of these phases than I put in this particular model. But I want you to keep in mind that this is a developmental model, and so you can see it's not in a particular order, although one of the sheets in the packet does have it sort of listed from top to bottom so that we can fit in all the activities that are action items. But it's important to keep that in mind because you might experience any one of these phases at a different time or multiple times than somebody else. I know for myself, I experience some of these phases multiple times a day. I might be bouncing in and out between uncertainty and my new normal when I feel motivated, or uncertainty and then just feeling like I've lost something by not being able to be at work or be with my clients. And then moving back to uncertainty, and then maybe getting into this stuck phase and feeling really restless and uncertain about how I'm going to go into the future. And so it's important to keep that in mind because you shouldn't feel as though you're doing it wrong. There really is no right way to go through these phases or get to the other end of this. So these are the particular phases that we've pointed out. And the part I want to focus on, though, is that big part in the middle. These are the 5 C's in terms of actions or types of actions to describe really how do we go about managing these phases. In that packet, you'll have more specific examples of what you might be able to do in each phase, like a grounding technique or using mindfulness or getting into goal setting during a certain phase. But for the purposes of this workshop, I just want you to focus on these 5 C's. So the first one is centering. Mindfulness is going to be critical. It's why we started today. Mindfulness is really about being present and allowing yourself to be present and accepting non-judgmentally about what your experience is. Now, you can practice this through actions of literal mindfulness meditations, or it can be really simple. You can just take some time to be mindful when you're washing your hands, to be mindful when you're making your coffee. That's my favorite one. I like to sit, watch the coffee, smell it as it comes out, and it only takes 2 minutes. And so if you're really engaging all of your senses in those moments, that's how we can be mindful for little moments throughout the day. And we don't have to worry about the judgment that we place on ourselves for us not being, like an hour-long meditator and never having any thoughts float through our head. That's really not what mindfulness is about. It's really about accepting all of the experience through all your senses that you're having and allowing those to be there so that you can learn more about yourself and allow yourself to be present. So mindfulness is key. Consistency is key, okay? So I'm sure you've all heard this. I'm sure you've been promoting it to your athletes or your coaches and your staff and whoever else it may be. But routines are super important. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. But consistency throughout your days in whichever ways you can do that. We don't really even realize how often we were consistent beforehand until we don't have that consistency anymore. So really start to work on those routines, whether that's your entire day or one portion of your day or how you go about each section of your day. The third C we want to focus on is connection. Socially connecting is so important. We might be physically distanced, but for your own sake, you're going to want to connect socially, and we'll get into that more a little bit later as well. But for these phases, this is what everybody's going to be going through. So these are some things that you can also pass on to your athletes and other personnel and staff members. So connection is going to be really important. Also controllables. So where you place your focus is something that is within your control. Maybe what you're experiencing emotionally and the thoughts that you have pop into your head won't be within your control, but what you can control is where you place your attention. So when we just went through that mindfulness and you were able to say, oh, I heard that siren in the background, or, oh, I felt my feet on the floor, and then I brought myself back to my breath, that was you focusing on what you can control, which is your attention, where you're placing it. And so in life, we have a lot of other things we can focus on that are within our control. And that's really critical because there's so much right now that is out of our control. Basically, we could spend all day listing all the things that are out of your control. So placing your attention on what you can control is going to be really important. And being creative. This one I love the most because we don't often think about that. But the truth is that wherever there are limitations, we should use those as our starting line for creativity. When you're talking with your athletes, or when you're going about your day, when you're going about setting an action item, or when you're using mindfulness or setting up your routine, be creative with it. You don't have to be on a one sheet of paper, black and white, just do whatever, list it all out, check off list 1, 2, 3, 4. Be creative. Use sticky notes, or use a different form of Zoom. Don't use Zoom. Use a game app to connect with your team, or be creative. I know there's tons of strength coaches out there that are being creative with all their lifting materials, and that's so awesome to see because it really boosts energy. And that's what you're going to want to sort of pull yourself and manage the time in which you're feeling bored or stuck. Sometimes creativity can be the key in that. So anytime you go look at what can I do in this moment, which is a great way of phrasing it, as opposed to what can I do, but what can I do in this moment? That's focusing on the controllable, the present. That's when you're going to want to be creative. Okay. So the next thing that I want to get into, or actually rather I'd like to go back for just a moment. So one of the things that these phases highlight, though, is that there are a lot of emotions and thoughts going on. And the stressors that are bringing these out, those are the same stressors that bring out mental health concerns. And again, as I said before, just because you're a coach or you're in an admin role or you have to take care of people doesn't mean you're immune to mental health, to these thoughts, these worries, the emotional ups and downs of whatever is going on in your life and the uncertainty, etc. And what we're seeing across the board is a real increase in anxiety, in depression, in substance use, as well as in eating and body concerns, disordered eating as well, habits that go along with disordered eating and substance use are coming back out again due to that stress, as well as a tremendous amount of loss and grief. And that is something, I think for those, I've seen those actually a lot in some of my older clients and older population. And when I say older, I mean not kids in middle school, although they're experiencing that uncertainty as well. But I'm seeing it in a lot of college student athletes with major change, and then also in some of the professional athletes that I work with and their coaches. And so I know what's going on with the college coaches as well. And so if you are somebody who has been experiencing this before, or if you're just experiencing uncertainty and you've never experienced that before, you could experience a greater level of anxiety or depressed symptoms. You could be experiencing an increase in substance use. And it's just important to be aware of that. And that is a normal response to uncertainty and to these major stressors, but that we want to keep being aware of those things and know that they can happen to us. Okay. Another thing that we're seeing a lot of right now, especially with people in your positions, sorry, I'm just checking the time, especially with people in your positions, is compassion fatigue and burnout. Because you have tasked yourself, which probably is not a new task for you, to take care of those around you, whether those are your family, whether that's your staff, or whether that's your student athletes. That's not something new, but the way that we're doing it in our households right now is at a tremendous increase. And the way that we have to go about it, because of all the limitations we're seeing, is causing a greater amount of strain and stress and emotional taxing. And so I think this is a really important piece of mental health that we need to talk about with people in your position, as opposed to, let's say, student athletes. So I want to just start with understanding what compassion fatigue is and what burnout is. And I'll really just point this out from the sense that the biggest differences between those two, and it's not that one is better or worse than the other, the biggest difference is that with compassion fatigue, there's a presence of trauma. And right now, it's uncertain the amount of trauma that some of your student athletes are facing, the amount of trauma that people are experiencing just by going home or just by living in this really uncertain, stressful health crisis. So the idea that you could be working with a lot of trauma has increased. We normally see this in hospitals or in military folk, mental health providers, but we're also starting to see it now with coaches, people in leadership positions, administrators, athletic trainers, because we don't really know the extent of the trauma that the student athletes are experiencing, and you're probably managing or helping them manage with that. And so it's important that you pay attention to that. Burnout is just as likely. The difference between those two, like I said, is the presence of trauma and the onset. Burnout usually takes a little bit longer. Compassion fatigue can come on rather quickly, which is also why we're seeing it now, because the amount of uncertainty, strain, stress, crisis came really quick, and then we had to manage it really quickly, and coaches had to step up and administrators had to step up and jump in and be the full force help for almost everybody around them, whether that was at home or at work. And so we're seeing compassion fatigue a lot more. But burnout is really important to pay attention to too. And the real reason why both of these are so important to pay attention to is because the signs of these things and the impact that it has on you can be tremendous. The emotional changes that you could be experiencing, the cognitive changes that come with compassion fatigue and burnout. I think what we mostly know is the burnout idea, which is that I just don't really feel motivated anymore, or I'm not really passionate, and I don't care very much. But we're seeing a lot of more elevation in that from coaches, especially managing the help that they need with their student athletes, managing the crises that their student athletes are experiencing, and managing that at home as well. It's just increasing everything. It's heightening everything. It's elevating all the levels of depressive symptoms, all the levels of isolation, all the levels of emotional dysregulation. And so if you find yourself experiencing irritability, or you're easily angered, or you find yourself having emotional activation levels just generally increased, and when that happens, by the way, that means our cognitive processing is going to go down. And so if you find yourself really angry and unable to think that's what's happening, or unable to act in the way that you maybe normally would act, that's what's really happening. And so I just want to point out these signs because I want you to be aware of them so you can start paying attention to them in yourself. You can start understanding, when am I really experiencing a real change or an impact on my identity and how I view the world? Or when am I feeling like my needs, whether those are health related, whether those are psychological related, whether those are emotionally related, when those are being compromised by the work that I'm doing or the help I'm trying to give. And this can be, the other thing I want you to pay attention to is your sleep. I think basically across the board, everybody's sleep has changed, and that's as a simple result of the fact that their days have changed, so your sleep is going to change. But there's an elevated change in your sleep. If you're having really disruptive sleep, if you can't sleep at all, normally our first thing is to say, well, we're feeling really anxious, we're having a lot of thoughts, so we don't know what to do about it, and that's why we can't sleep. But if this is going on for a long extended period of time, that dysregulation of your sleep is going to impact these things as well. And then it gets a little bit out of hand in understanding where it started. And so I want to tell you about the signs first. If you know that you're engaging with your student athletes or your staff or each other in a way that's putting a lot of help out there, and that's really wonderful, and you're really taking on a lot of supportive roles, that's amazing and wonderful, and I'm sure everybody is grateful for that. But it's so important that we understand the toll that that takes on us, especially as coaches, because even though we had done this before, even though all of you had taken on that role, you know, I've been in many recruiting meetings where you talk to those parents and you tell them you're going to take care of their kids, or that they're in your hands. And so we haven't lost that just because they went home. And so when you're doing that, just know it can take a real toll, especially with the amount of trauma and the amount of crisis that's going on. That's just heightened a lot more. So pay attention to these factors in yourself first, so that you can start to engage with what's going to be helpful for those things. Not all of it is, you know, I'm not feeling motivated, so I just need to get over it. Or I'm not feeling passionate anymore, so I just need to get over it or push through. There are going to be some real tools that we're about to talk about that can help you manage not just compassion fatigue and burnout, but also all the other levels of mental health that you may be experiencing, or all the other phases that you may be walking yourself through right now on a day-to-day basis. So here's where I want to talk about being ISO'd in isolation. So being ISO'd, these are the 5 keys that I'm really passionate about with regards to coaches and athletic personnel in athletic departments. This is important for your role as a person, for your role as a family person, for your role in relationships, for your role as a coach. These 5 things I think are critical at this time. So the first one is intentionality. So we talked about routines earlier. It's so important that we establish a routine, that we set up a workspace, that we engage in health and exercise, And even things like seeking nature, these are things that we know are important for you to all engage in right now. And that's kind of where we started with the mental phases. That's what you're going to get from that information. But the second step of that, and probably the most important one, especially for coaches and those in the roles that you're in, is to be intentional about these things. It's not just about doing the routine. It's not just about, oh, hey, I set up my workspace. It's about while you're doing that and while you're engaging with that, that you're intentional about it, that you know why you're doing it. And that when you sit down at that desk, you say to yourself and you check in with yourself, I'm doing this for this. This is my purpose in doing this. When I go exercise, it's not just because it's on my routine sheet or just because I'm a coach. It's because I know that I need exercise right now to feel regulated, to engage with important values that I have about health and exercise. And while you're actually doing it, you should be talking to yourself about that. You should be engaging yourself in an intentional manner. I always talk about this story. I had clients all the time that would go get coffee, but say they didn't do anything that day. And I would ask them, well, what did you do when you went to get coffee? And they said, well, I went to get coffee, and they walked me through. I went to get coffee and I went out and I said hello to the barista, and then I left. And I said, okay, well, why'd you say hello? Well, I don't know. It was nice. Well, why is it important to be nice? That's important to be nice because I care about being nice to other people. And as we talk that through, which is the same process you can take yourself through, we're building intention for them. So when they go get coffee the next day, which obviously we're not doing right now, but the idea is the same. When you go get the coffee and you say hello, you say, I'm saying hello because this is important to me and I have meaning and purpose now with this action that I'm taking, even though it was just the one action I did right then. So when you seek nature, find that purpose. When you set up your workspace or you establish your routine and you're finding yourself go through it, be intentional with it. Say, this is the reason I'm doing it. This is why, and have that conversation with you while you're doing it. The next one, we've spoken about this a lot. It cannot be lost upon you all, is social connection. And I want to share this particularly for coaches because we tend, or you all tend, and those in athletics tend to feel isolated even at a faster rate because in your offices, it's only your staff that's with your team and your exact experiences. So even when you can share with each other about what's going on your team, it never feels like everybody's going through what you're going through. And so we try to find people, maybe if we're really working hard at it, we try to find people who we can connect with. But sometimes that's really difficult. So this piece for coaches in terms of social connection is really about saying we're at a very rare time where everybody is sharing the same experience. And so that needs to be used to our advantage. When we reach out, we don't have to reach out saying, this is what's exactly happening on my field, in my pool at this time. We need to reach out and say, this is what I'm experiencing. Are you experiencing this too? How are you managing this within your team? Because you're not really experiencing, you are having really individualized experience with your athletes, but they're all going through the same thing too. So if we can connect with each other on that and realize the power of that shared experience, which we often don't get, that's going to really get us to the root of helping each other. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. The next one, ownership, super important. Coaches always love to talk to athletes about owning what they're doing. And I want to talk to you all about that now too. This is about taking ownership. Earlier, we talked about focusing on the controllables and what is within your control. And when we take ownership over our attention, it really allows us to say in times of when I'm focused on what I can't control, or when I'm focused on the fact that I can't do these things or I don't have these things, that we can say to ourselves, no, I'm going to take ownership over this experience and what is within my control. And I'm going to find what I do have, what I can accomplish, what I can do in 2 minutes. Today, all of you practice mindfulness for 2 minutes. I don't know who's done it before, who hasn't, who has a bad experience with it, who doesn't. But either way, you took those 2 minutes and you said, oh, this is what I can do in 2 minutes. And then you did it. So take ownership over the time you do have, the resources you do have. And then secondly, and this gets back into the mental health side of things, taking ownership over your emotions and your thoughts. This is not time to say, I want to avoid those things, which is our tendency. I don't want to experience those things. I want to avoid them. I want to get over them. I want to get through them. They're yours. Own them. If you're experiencing that sense of loss because your season ended abruptly, if you're experiencing that sense of grief because you have a family member who's suffering from an illness right now or who has recently passed, Or if your athletes are experiencing that loss, talk to them about that. Own the emotions of what comes along with that, the sadness, the lack of comfort, or the lack of finality, the uncertainty. Own those emotions. They're yours. Don't let them own you. You don't have to run away from them or avoid them. In fact, that's usually when we find that they increase. If you think of when you push a ball underneath, a beach ball underneath a pool water, and you push it down, what happens? It comes right back up. That's how we manage emotions as well. We try to push them away, they come right back up. So take this opportunity to own them. And while you're owning them, have some empathy for yourself. This one is so important. People, from coaching all the way through student athletes, they really skip over this piece of empathy and self-compassion. But I want you to know that it's not a limited resource. So if you are trying to be empathetic towards your athletes and you're putting out all that great compassion for your colleagues and family members that are experiencing this trauma or this crisis as well, that's wonderful, but it's not limited. If you give yourself empathy, and if you spend some time with yourself and give yourself self-compassion for being uncertain or from bouncing back and forth between being motivated and then not motivated, give yourself that self-compassion. That doesn't take away from others. It's not a competition about where you can place all your compassion. It's not limited. Please take the time to give yourself that empathy so that you have more time to give it to others as well. And check in with yourself. That second part is really important. I think we've talked about that a couple times with the phases, as well as with the symptoms and signs of burnout and compassion fatigue. Make sure you're checking in with yourself with empathy and compassion. You're feeling this way. Maybe you don't like it, but you can have compassion for yourself about it. And the last piece that I want to talk about is demonstration. Coaches, modeling is the key. You can model for yourself, for your families in your area. You can model for your colleagues, and you can model for your student athletes. You do not have to have all the right answers to all the uncertain questions. You don't have to tell them the exact action that's going to make them do all the right things. And you don't have to have that for yourself either. What you can do is just model the steps that we've talked about. You can model self-care by saying, or you can model your routine by saying, sending your routine to your teams. Or you can model your routine by engaging in it for yourself every day and telling your teams about it or telling your colleagues about it. You can model intention and connection by actually engaging your student athletes when on a regular basis, whenever that is. I know you're all doing it. And so when you do those things, you can model self-compassion. You can talk about the routine you've set up. You don't have to tell them how to set it up. You can just talk about your own. Demonstration is so important. It's such a big part of learning, which I know you all know because you're coaches. But in this case, it works just as well for routines, for intention, for connection, for mindfulness and being present, and sharing that. And then the last piece that I just want to mention really quick for you all is so important, is demonstrating and modeling reaching out if more help is needed. Earlier on, I talked about the increase of anxiety and depression, the increase of substance use and eating concerns, loss and grief, and the increase of mental health overall as a result of the major stressors that everybody's facing. And if you're experiencing that, modeling reaching out can really be helpful for your student athletes, for your colleagues, and for yourself. Of course, I want you to reach out anyway, but I know coaches, they might not want to reach out. And so they don't want to feel like they can't manage it on their own. So if you want to think about it this way, I would encourage you to do so. Every time you reach out and you can express that you've reached out to do that, you're modeling that for that person you're talking to, for your athletes, for your colleagues. So you can take on that role as well. So being ISO during isolation is so important. These 5 pieces are really important. You know, the part about the action items earlier about the mental phases of COVID-19 and mental health in general, the actions themselves are important, but doing them with this behind you, with intention, doing them through connection, engaging with your emotions with ownership, right? Like engaging mindfulness with ownership over the emotions as opposed to avoidance over those emotions. Having self-compassion or accepting your emotions with self-compassion rather than judgment, that it's okay to be experiencing those things, and taking action for the purpose of or in front of as a way to model. That's what this is really about, is the way you go about the actions from earlier. or the actions that you go about with yourself and with your teams. And these are the ways that you're really going to help manage your mental health as well. Okay. Now, I think there's about 5 minutes left. I don't know if that's a lot of time or a little time. I don't know if I talk too fast, but I don't know if it was mentioned I'm originally from New Jersey, so talk a little bit fast. But if there are any questions, I'd love to hear from you all, and I'd love to try to help answer some of them. And I think Emily, maybe.
Yes, that was fantastic, Jaimie. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. As Jaimie said, we've only got a few minutes here left. So if you all have any questions for Jaimie, now would be the time to send them her way in the chat function. Hopefully we can get those answered. But if there aren't any questions, we will go ahead and wrap this up a little early. But while we are waiting to see if there's any questions, Jaimie, is there anything that you have kind of as a I leave you with this type piece before we wrap up?
Oh, well, if being ISO during isolation, I would want to leave you with that. But I think what I would want to leave you with is probably where I started with those two quotes from the beginning. And even especially that second one, or the first one too, but that second one is, just to say that how you're reacting to this time with anxiety and fear and stress and uncertainty, that is actually your brain's way of saving you from harm. That's how we were developed, to acknowledge threat and know when it's happening so that we don't die. And so if you're experiencing that, like, that's okay and that's normal. I really want you to all understand and take that in so that you can start to manage it, because we can't manage it before we accept it.
Awesome. So we actually did get a question, got a couple questions. So one, coaches feel like they need to be a source of strength for their athletes. What is your recommendation for how vulnerable and open that coaches should be with their athletes regarding the challenges they're facing during this time?
What an excellent question. I think it speaks to, how vast this crisis is, how it's in with all the coaches, all the athletes, and what they're experiencing. And I would encourage you to be open for the sake of modeling and sharing how to be open, how to accept your emotions. If you find yourself leaning on your team in a way that's asking them too much, which if you're asking this question, you probably aren't doing that, to be honest with you. But I would be open with them. I would open the discussion up, share your part, and encourage them to share theirs. So that's how I would sort of manage the balance there. If you feel like you're calling your team to say, this is what's going on with me, and then hanging up the phone, that's probably leaning on them in a way that's not giving them the opportunity for space. But if you're all getting together and you're able to model and be open and vulnerable and share the emotions, the uncertainty you're experiencing, and then allowing them to be in that space, ask for their experiences, now you're all getting in on it together, and you're all understanding that this is a shared experience, that we all have emotions, and that we all are uncertain, and that's where we're really at. So I would actually encourage you to be open, and then leave space for them to be open as well, if you feel like the balance for you leaning on them is going to tip too much in that direction.
Perfect. That's great feedback. I think we got time for one more question here, Jaimie. So real quick, what are some good self-care ideas during this time at home?
Well, that's also a great question. I think self-care starts with really an individual exploration in terms of what your needs are. Self-care, I've seen lists of self-care items that are like 200 things long because everybody has a different way of caring for themselves. So I think right off the bat, the first thing you want to do is ask yourself, what is important to me that maybe I'm not getting, or that I can't get, and how can I go about getting that, or engaging in a creative way that allows me that? And then while you're going through your day, ask yourself, when do I feel a little spike of happiness or a little spike of motivation? That's likely connected to some sort of self-care for yourself. And then like basic self-care things right now, mindfulness, getting into nature, seeking out nature in whatever way you can. taking time to do things that you hadn't done before or learning something new. Those are the 4 kind of biggest ones for self-care. Because when we find that we take like 2 minutes to open up to something new or 10 minutes to open up to something new, that's actually caring for a different piece of yourself that you didn't even know existed, and that could spark some excitement, motivation. And by the way, I just want to say, if there are more questions, if you want to save the chat, I'll be happy to answer some questions afterwards and kind of send you those answers, and you can send them out with the packet.
Perfect. Yeah. So it is 10:46. We're a minute over time here, so we want to be respectful. No, you are all good, Dr. Rubin. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you to everybody who's attended the webinar. And especially, again, thank you, Dr. Rubin. I'm going to hand it off to Dan here for one last quick point before we adjourn here.
Yeah, I want to just thank Dr. Rubin again, but also thank Premier Sports Psychology. The partnership that we've created over the last several years has been great. I know that the organization worked with several of our schools as well, and you've been on campuses. So we really appreciate that, especially in this time of need. So coaches, best of luck to you all. Stay healthy, stay in, and continue the hard work. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.